Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Tonight, my guest is Dr. Shawn Phillip Cooper, who is the assistant editor and arts columnist at the European Conservative and vice president of the International Courtly Literature Society of North America, formerly of the James Madison program at Princeton University. Did I get all of that right?
That is correct, yes.
Hey. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here.
We know of one another, of course, through Twitter. How have you been on Twitter long?
A very long time, actually. I think I created my first Twitter account back in, I want to say 2007. And I still have that one, but I don't use it anymore. It's sort of like a dead account where I post pictures from video games mostly. But in 2012, when I was a PhD student at Wayne State University, I took a course, actually a seminar on the digital humanities with the late Julie Klein, and she suggested that everyone should have a Twitter account because that's where all the important conversations in the digital humanities were happening. So rather reluctantly, I created such an account, and it's gained a little bit of popularity over the intervening 12 years. So I'm very glad she twisted my arm and got me to do that.
Do you find it useful?
In terms of work, it's both useful and useless, right? In kind of equal measure. I don't know that I find it very useful in terms of like dialogue and discussion, because I've been on Twitter for so long. In the early days, Stephen Fry was just about the most followed Twitter guy around. And he said famously, Twitter is for jokes. It's not called deep thought for a reason. And I kind of subscribe to that notion that it's more of a place to kind of lark about and have fun. And you get to know people who then can, prove, useful or intellectually stimulating. But generally, I just use it as a place to mess around. With that said, I can credit Twitter with introducing me to people who've become really excellent friends. People like Adrian Vermeule and Robbie George, which is kind of part of the reason I think that I was invited to the Madison program. So it's been a really great networking tool to get to know people who have similar views and similar concerns about civilization and the arts.
Yes, Robbie George. There's a guy who does not joke around on Twitter. He's going for the deep thoughts.
He really is, and he can do it really well.
Right.
He has a measured and unimpeachable respectability that I don't have. I'm more of a clown, I think, and I can be serious, but I tend to be serious in my writing and in my work. But on Twitter, that's just kind of where I mess around.
Speaking of your work, tell us what the International Courtly Literature Society of North America is.
I'd love to. Okay, so the ICLS-NAB, that's the North American branch of the International Courtly Literature Society, is the local branch for me, right, or for people, scholars in North America, mostly Canadians and Americans, as you might expect. It's, I think, the largest of the ICLS branches, although maybe the British branch is larger. I can't remember. But they're near us, or we're near them. And the ICLS is an international scholarly association. So most of the members are professors or professors emerita who are at the top of their field in the kind of copious understanding of courtly literature, which means broadly speaking, medieval literature from the high Middle Ages, so no earlier really than about 900, and no later than about 1500. So in that 500 or 600 years or so, not just in English, but in Occitan, Norman French, High French, German, Spanish. So there were different branches in different countries in Europe and around the world.
And does Arthuriana fall in there?
It does, right? It's part of courtly literature. There's another society of which I'm a member called the International Arthurian Society, which is similar to the ICLS. It's a larger organization, but it has a slightly different focus, right? Everyone there is working on Arthuriana. So if someone is working on Chrétien de Troyes, they're specifically working on Arthurian stuff. whereas someone in the ICLS might look at the non-Arthurian works as well.
What is Arthuriana?
That's, well, it used to be called the Matter of Britain, right? It's one of the three great matters: the matter of Britain, the matter of France, and the matter of England. And the matter of Britain deals with King Arthur, his Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, Lancelot, these things that we think of today as kind of the archetypical story of the Sword and the Stone, right? Disney, Camelot, that sort of thing. So anything that kind of revolves around that or that is about that falls under the Matter of Britain and what we now call Arthuriana. But the reason we don't use the word Matter of Britain is because Arthuriana is slightly larger than that. It encompasses not just literature, which is what the Matter of Britain normally falls under, but also visual art, films, video games, anything you can think of, comics. So even modern stuff. There was is it Sharknado 4 or something that has Neil deGrasse Tyson as Merlin sending everyone back in time. That's Arthuriana. It's a ridiculous form of Arthuriana, but nevertheless worthy of study.
What is the Matter of France and the Matter of England?
So the Matter of France is Roland, Charlemagne. So if you've read the Chanson de Roland, the great tale of Roland at the Battle of Roncesvalles, where he dies, of course, famously. Charlemagne arrives too late. He's blowing his horn finally, but again, too late. So that's the Matter of France, the tales about stories about Roland. And the Matter of England is a variety of stories, including things like King Ban and King Horn. And I regret that these are rather understudied. They're actually quite good. So hopefully me mentioning them will encourage someone to go look up King Ban or King Horn and read about them. They're fine stories, but they're from what we might now think of as like the Danish or Germanic tradition rather than the Matter of Britain, which is really, it's kind of a combination of the Welsh stroke Brittonic tradition and the French tradition, what's called the Lancelot Grail, the prose Lancelot, which is actually a series of stories about Lancelot that were originally written in French.
What appeals to you about King Arthur?
Well, there's several different things, and it's kind of difficult to nail any one thing down. But one thing that I think is particularly appealing, maybe the most appealing thing for me, is that I think as far as tragedies go, it's probably the most perfectly constructed tragedy that I've ever encountered. And I'm not thinking of any particular work, although I'm an expert in Malory particularly, and I do a lot of work on Malory, although my dissertation was on both Malory and Tennyson. Tennyson's fantastic as well. But broadly speaking, Malory does something quite clever to foreground the tragedy. He calls his great kind of collection of Arthuriana, he condenses a bunch of French works and a handful of Middle English works, and creates what he called Le Mort d'Arthur, right? The death of Arthur. Mm-hmm. So it's right there on the cover. You know what's going to happen even before you open the book. Now, of course, everyone in Malory's time knew what happened. They grew up with these stories. It was as obvious to them as Hansel and Gretel or the Three Little Pigs is to us. It was just a tale that everyone knew. It was They were simmering in it, and it had been going on for hundreds of years. It was extremely popular from the moment that it was created, but especially once it entered the court in around the 11th century. And indeed, Richard the First's mother was an enormous fan of it and was a great patron of Arthurian writers and troubadours, and that kind of entered the courtly culture. So what happens in Arthuriana is that from the very beginning, you know that Arthur must die. That's kind of the premise of the story. And so what you're treated to as you read the story in its various forms is the constant possibility, which is always just slightly missed, that Arthur could establish a kingdom of peace and order that would endure. And there's just these constant fatal missteps. And when you read them, there's something really quite very sad and touching about it, but also something that I think speaks to our own humanity. We can see ourselves making those exact same mistakes. They're not the sort of mistakes that you shake your head and you say, why would you do such a thing? They're the kind of mistakes where you put your head in your hands and you say, I would have done the same thing. And that would have led to this great tragedy. Indeed, it does. It leads to the downfall of Arthur's kingdom. It becomes a case where, you can almost see a man who does nothing wrong, but he still fails. And that's, I think, a very important lesson about life, one that we're not taught enough. We're always taught that if you do everything right, then you'll succeed. But what I think the Morte d'Arthur and the Matter of Britain teach us is it's possible to make all right decisions and still fail.
For people who might not be very familiar, how can you tell us the story in a few sentences? I mean, not necessarily a few sentences, but
it might be tough in a few sentences.
Briefly.
Give me a couple paragraphs.
All right,
so briefly, where should we begin? How about with Uther? I think that's the most relevant part. England is in a state of civil strife. It's unstable. Its kings are at war with one another. There's not a clear line of succession. Eventually, a king takes over, and his name is Uther Pendragon. He's not a particularly good king, but he's not a particularly bad king either. He's just kind of average, right? He invites, once he becomes king, all of his sub-kings, right? They're kings too, but they owe him fealty, to his court to pay him homage. And the Duke of Tintagel comes with his wife. Her name is Igraine. And as soon as Uther sets eyes on Igraine, he falls in love with her. This is a problem because she's the wife of one of his most powerful retainers, effectively. So he makes it very clear to her at this feast how he feels about her. And she tells her husband, well, it seems to me we were sent to be, put to dishonor because look how the king is carrying on. We should leave immediately. So they do leave. And this, of course, is a verboten thing. It looks really bad. He hadn't permission to leave. And so Uther tells the Duke of Tintagel, well, you must return. It's inappropriate for you to leave. And the Duke says, well, I'm not coming back because I know what your designs on my wife are. So Uther says, all right, you better wall yourself up, get all the food you can, because in no time at all, I'm going to fetch you out of the strongest castle you have, and I'll have your wife. So he lays siege to Tintagel. And Tintagel is a real place. It's a little tiny island off the coast of Cornwall in England. And it's connected to the land by a tiny little causeway of land, probably about 10 feet wide. So there really was a castle built on it. So this is a real place that the authors of this story knew about and kind of fitted into this tale they were creating. And who knows if it were ever, how much of this is true or not, but it is a real place. So it's very well, defended. You can't get to it easily. And so the siege is laid, and the Duke doesn't show any signs of failing, and Uther doesn't show any sign of leaving. So on it goes. Until Merlin comes along. We all like to hear about Merlin because that tells us of magic. And Merlin says to him, well, you know what? I'll make you a deal. I can get you into Tintagel, and you can have your way with Igraine. But there's a cost. And the cost is this. You're going to conceive a son on her, and he's mine. When he's born, you have to give him to me. And Uther says, anything you want. If you can make this happen, whatever. So Merlin disguises, using magic, Uther. He makes him look like the Duke of Tintagel. And he gets some of Uther's knights and himself, and they disguise themselves as other of Uther's knights. Other of the Duke of Tintagel's knights. And they ride Tintagel. And they see what appears to be the Duke of Tintagel coming in. Now, he's actually gone out to do a battle. So they're surprised to see him come back, but they let him in. And, of course, they don't know that it's Uther in disguise. And so Uther, hurries on quickly to Igraine's room, and she's surprised to see him. But he says, I came home early to see you because I just had to have you. And so they have sexual relations, and indeed a son is conceived. And while this is going on, the real Duke gets himself killed in battle. Anyway, the morning comes and Uther, disguised as the Duke, rides out and leaves. And so it transpires that eventually the Duke is found to be dead, the siege is ended, and Uther takes Igraine as his wife, legitimately, as a king. It's a right of conquest. And he then asks her, how did you come to be pregnant? And she says, well, I'll tell you, but don't be angry. And he says, okay. She says, my husband came to me and laid with me and conceived this child. But then I later learned that he was dead. And so I don't know what happened. It must have been a spirit or something. And Uther says, oh, no, don't worry. That was me. And she's really happy to hear this, which is rather appalling to us. But she's concerned about her progeny and having the realm like within her grasp. It's about power dynamics, really, as many royal marriages were at the time. Mm-hmm. So this transpires. The child is born, and he's given to Merlin. And she's not mad about this, Igraine. She's fine, because he's going to be well cared for. He's going to be fostered with Sir Ector, one of Uther's best knights. And if you are familiar with the Disney Sword in the Stone, this is where that story takes off, right? You have young Arthur, and he's living with Sir Kay, who's his kind of foster brother, and he doesn't know he's a king. And he's brought up. Uther goes mad and dies, and they're looking for who will be king. Nobody knows that Arthur is his heir. And then in the churchyard appears, of course, as we all know, the sword through the anvil. And it says on it, whoever shall draw this sword out of this anvil shall be rightwise king of Britain. So everyone tries, nobody can do it. So a tournament is held. And while the tournament is going on, Kay forgets his sword. Arthur says, oh, I know where there's a sword. So he runs off to the churchyard and pulls the sword out of the anvil as if it were butter, gives it to Kay. And Kay looks at it and says, oh, I know what this is. I'm king of England. And he tells his father, I'm king of England. And his father says, did you pull this out? And he says, well, no, Arthur did. And Ector is astonished. So they go back and they make him put it in and pull it out, put it in and pull it out. Then everyone comes and sees it. And it's not all clear as it is in the Disney program. There's a war that has to be fought. Not everyone is convinced of this, right? It's a rather unusual way to get yourself a king, through magical swords stuck in anvils. So, some people are not ready to submit. Merlin explains to them that he's Uther's son, but not everyone is interested in following a beardless boy, as they call him. So he has to fight a war, and he wins, and eventually he becomes king. Along the way, he establishes what we now call the Round Table, his best knights. He gets this big round table that can seat 150 knights. His fame attracts knights from around the world, including Lancelot, who comes over from France. And Lancelot becomes his best knight because he's the best knight in the world. And it transpires that Lancelot falls in love with Arthur's wife, whose name is Guinevere. Much like his father, Arthur sees Guinevere and instantly falls in love with her, even though he shouldn't. And Merlin tells him, you really shouldn't. Don't marry Guinevere. I'll find you a pretty girl who will make you happy. And Arthur says, well, I want Guinevere. Merlin says, well, she'll betray you, and your best friend will betray you with her, and it will be really bad. But where a man's heart is set, arguments do not prevail. So you'll have Guinevere then. And this is, of course, exactly what happens. Lancelot falls in love with Guinevere, and a sort of love triangle develops. They have an adulterous relationship. Arthur kind of, sort of knows about this, but doesn't want to do anything about it. Lancelot's his best friend. Guinevere is his wife. He loves her. And so he doesn't really want to rock the boat. Also, it would destabilize the kingdom. Whilst Arthur is still a young man, his sister, half-sister, by Igraine, his mother, and Uther, so his half-sister by way of his mother, he has a sister named Morgan, and she's a sort of enchantress. And she disguises herself and convinces Arthur to sleep with her. So this is incest, right? It's this half-sister. And she conceives a child, and the child's name is Mordred. Now, she's married to King Lot. He's the king of Orkney. And they have a bad relationship. He's one of the rebellious guys that Arthur has to beat in order to become king. So he has these nephews, and one nephew who's like also his son, Mordred, the Orkney boys. And their names are Gawain, or Gawain, Gareth, Gaheris, Agravain, and last of all, Mordred. And they're problematic, right? They're all built up in like tribal loyalties. They believe in the blood feud. They're not interested in Arthur's idea of a sort of like what we would think of, I guess, as a modern kingdom, a land of law and order and rules and principles. They're interested in family loyalties and clan and that sort of thing. And this causes friction. They don't behave particularly well. They don't follow the rules of the Round Table. But Arthur doesn't discipline them very much because they're also his nephews. And they don't really, they're part of a different world almost. The Orkneys are at the extreme northern end of Britain. They're out in the North Sea. Well, this leads to trouble because Mordred, of course, finds out about Lancelot and Guinevere. It's sort of an open secret. And everyone follows Arthur's lead. You know, they know about it, but they don't talk about it. But Mordred and Agravain don't follow that lead. They become very resentful. Lancelot saves their lives a few times. That makes it worse because now they owe him, right? There's a psychological factor here. They don't like him, and now they owe him, which means they like him even less. And they grow to hate him. Mallory says they have a privy hate. It's a private hate, right? It's not due to anything that affects the realm. It's just a personal dislike. And they eventually come to Arthur and say, well, we can catch him. Pretend to go away, and we'll lurk in the castle. And as soon as he goes into her room, and he will, we'll catch him red-handed. And Arthur says, I think this is a bad idea. He's likely to kill you. He is Lancelot, after all. And we don't really need this. But if you insist, then the law requires it, basically. So he does, and this is what happens. Lancelot goes to their room. They try to apprehend him. He's unarmed. And he still manages to kill a dozen of them and nearly kill Mordred. He kills Agravain and gets away. Well, of course, civil war ensues, and the long and the short of it is that eventually the kingdom splits in half. Arthur's off besieging Lancelot in France, and he leaves Mordred at home. Mordred tries to take over the kingdom. He declares Arthur dead. This is something that King John did with Richard I, of course, in the 11th century. As soon as Arthur's out of the kingdom, he declares him dead and declares himself king. He tries to marry Guinevere, which is also another kind of incest, right? That's his father's wife. And eventually Arthur is aware of this. He comes rushing back, and they fight a massive battle at a place called Camlin. And there, Mordred deals a mortal blow to Arthur, and Arthur kills Mordred. And then, of course, the rest is the stuff that we're familiar with. Excalibur being thrown back into the lake, Arthur going into the boat with the three maidens and sailing to the Isle of Avalon for the healing of his grievous wound. And that's the end. Camelot falls, and the realm passes away. The Round Table Knights disperse and disappear. And for the medieval reader, this is why things are in such a bad way, because it was great once, and now we're all these generations removed. For them, it took place roughly in the 8th century. So, you know, they're hundreds of years removed from this, and things are just getting worse every day. So it provides a nice explanation, a way to look back to a golden era, and now look how far we've come from that, and things will be worse in the future, and they're bad now.
What's the point of that story?
Well, I think there's a lot of different points, right? Because it's such a large story, which is why it takes so long just to recount even the central plot points. One thing has to do with the nature of the political structure of England, right? Which is what Mallory gets into at the end of his book. He, in a very famous passage, inveighs against his contemporaries. People turn their backs on Arthur and sign up with Mordred. Because Mallory ruefully and bitterly says, you know, and they said that it had always been war with Arthur and it would be peace under Mordred, and that it was always strife under Arthur and it would be prosperity under Mordred. Which, of course, isn't true at all. It's completely false, right? It's the opposite of that. And Mallory says, you know, lo ye all Englishmen, pay attention, my brothers. Look at this. This has always been our fault. We're newfangled. That's the 16th century, or the 15th century word that Mallory uses. Obsessed with novelty. We always want something new. And so we've had this really great king for a long time, but we're sick of it. It's boring. We want something new. Mordred's new, right? Mordred's going to give us something different. Different and horrible, but different. So that's one of the lessons. Another lesson, I think, has to do with the very difficult, maybe irresolvable contradictions in the culture of chivalry and personal loyalty and the beginnings of the polity that are all kind of swimming around from really the beginning of the Plantagenets. That's Henry I, Henry II, all the way down to the end of the medieval era at Bosworth Field in 1485, which is incidentally is the year that Le Morte d'Arthur is published. That's when Richard III dies and the medieval era kind of ends, right? We get the beginning of the Tudor era under Henry VII. So that sort of medieval worldview where people believed you could somehow balance loyalty to family, loyalty to your lady, loyalty to your wife, loyalty to the church, loyalty to your knights and the serfs that you had to support, loyalty to your liege lord, and loyalty to any petty barons under whose power you might find yourself. And that somehow all of these things could be neatly balanced in chivalry. I think Malory kind of explodes that, and it's just not possible. There's too many competing power structures to which one owes one's duty, and there's not a clear hierarchy that one is over the other, right? They're all equally important. So how are you supposed to navigate that? And the reality is you can't. Any realm founded in such a way will eventually pull itself apart. I think Malory is getting at that. And one last thing I'd say is that Malory is personally concerned about the decline of chivalry. For Malory, he's thinking when he's writing about in Morte d'Arthur, he's thinking of this imagined past. But he's also thinking about a chivalry that did exist, a real historical chivalry. And that's the chivalry of the early High Middle Ages, so like the 10th and 11th centuries under people like William Marshall, which comes from the French, chevalerie, horse combat, right? It's military training, and that's all it is. There's no cultural connotation. It's not about wearing fancy clothes or going on parades or even having fancy tilts. It's not about courtly love, amour courtois, as my friends in the ICLS would say, or a fin d'amour. It's none of that. It's just purely military developments. Learning to fight on horseback is a significant military development. It puts you streets ahead of anyone who can't do it. And at first, that is a very tightly knit thing to which you are born, because it requires money. You have to have a horse. You have to be able to focus entirely on it. You can't be doing anything else, right? It's something you spend a lifetime learning. You start when you're very young. You have to outfit a horse. You have to be able to afford armor. You have to have squires to assist you. So it's really limited to a handful of people who have the wherewithal to do this. But it's specifically military. By the time Malory is writing this in the 15th century, that's not the way things are at all. And that's one of the major complaints that leads to the Wars of the Roses, which of course leads to the death of Richard III at Bosworth, is that the Yorkist king, Edward IV, is replacing his lords of the blood, people who are hereditary, with newfangled upstarts who are new, right? They're jumped up, they're nobodies, and they're friends and lackeys and sycophants and things like that. So this is very upsetting to Malory. He sees it as the degradation of chivalry from military training to cultural, social, courtliness, something that you strut around, right, in your knickers, and you get extra lands and you spend all your time flattering the king. It has nothing to do with your prowess, which is the preeminent virtue for Malory, your strength under arms, your ability to do knightly combat.
What is Merlin?
So Merlin is a wizard, right?
But what does that mean?
Yeah, well, exactly. What does it mean? He's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I think that a lot of people who haven't read Arthuriana, or only kind of dimly aware of it, think of him like Gandalf, maybe, or Harry Potter.
What's the difference between Merlin and Gandalf? That's
a great question, right? So, I think Merlin is closer to Gandalf than he is to Harry Potter, right? It's not Alohomora and Wingardium Leviosa and Swish and Flick and magic wands and things like that. That's not how Merlin is, because he's he's written in the 11th century, right? He's not like that at all. He's in some ways much more tangible than Harry Potter, right? Or Gandalf. The magic of Harry Potter is magic. It's inexplicable. You say magic words and things happen, right? It's not really what Merlin does. because Merlin has a real concrete backstory that's based in sort of the things that everyone believed. It wasn't fantasy, it was reality.
The backstory of Merlin is that he was born in Wales and he grew up as kind of a weird kid who had powers.
More than that, he's the son of the devil, right? He has no mortal father. His mother is seduced by a devil, or the devil, depending on which version you're reading. And this is covered in what's called the Prose Merlin, which is a very, very long story of Merlin's life. And she gives birth to Merlin. And he actually fights off the devil, makes him go away, and frees his mother from the influence of this satanic figure. And he's a very good man. But he's also not, he's a demi-human, right? He's half human, half devil, angel, demon. And so he's not entirely of this world, but he is of reality, right? People in the medieval era wholeheartedly believed in devils and angels and demons on earth in physical form. So that wasn't like a fantastical thing for them to imagine. It was perfectly rational. So this explains how it is that he's able to command natural forces and also how to disguise himself.
Would he be something kind of in the line of like Atlas or Hercules, these guys who are sort of the human son of the gods?
Exactly. I think that's a pretty good analogy. And they're like, Hercules is super powerful, right? He's got power far beyond that of any mortal man, and yet he's not unbelievable. There's a perfectly rational explanation in the minds of the listeners, right, for why he's like this. And so it was with Merlin. He's not doing things that people couldn't believe. Right? He's not turning the world inside out or changing the gravitational constant of the universe or anything like that. But he is doing things that appear to be supernatural, but are always connected to his origins. So the fact that he can disguise himself in other people is tied to the fact that that's what the devil can do. The devil can appear in many forms, right? Demons can appear as anything. So he has that power.
Why is this story so enduring? What's the human meaning in it that makes people still love it, you think?
Well, I think that its tragic core is probably the most important thing to a degree. Maybe there's some, I don't know, superficial things. People like knights and wizards, and right. Maybe that's part of it. But there are plenty of stories of knights and wizards that don't endure. So I think that the tragic core is what makes it very different from any other story that you might read from the era. And the best stories always do have something, some kind of narrative device that makes them endure. For example, Gawain and the Green Knight, which people still read, right? We study it today. Tolkien did his own version of it, which is really wonderful. It also has a really interesting core, right? Which is the game, the gift game. That event, then there's like the plot twist at the end, like, aha, the Green Knight was your host all along. And now you've got to give him what you took. And that means the kisses, right? So does that mean Gawain loses his head? No, right? He just gets a little nick and he gets sent home. And then the whole thing is a lesson about courtesy. Well, I think the lesson on courtesy is probably lost on us to a degree. It would have had a lot more impact, and did have more impact, in the medieval court. But the idea of the gift game and the promise he makes his host and the supernatural knight, all of those elements, I think, do still appeal to us. And something similar is going on with Arthuriana, right? There's an important twist. And the twist, of course, is both the central love story and the really tragic dimension of Arthur's ultimate fall, right? He falls because of his son, Mordred. And T.H. White, in his version of Arthuriana, which is called The Once and Future King, it's a tetralogy, 4 books. There's a 5th, actually, but they're all kind of combined together into a single uber tome. When he writes of Arthur, he says something to, I can't remember the exact quote because it's quite long, but it's something to the effect of, Arthur falls because of Mordred. Ultimately, it's his incestuous relationship with his half-sister, and then the result of that poisoned union that brings down Camelot. It's Mordred who can't brook Lancelot and Guinevere. It's Mordred who pulls the kingdom down. It's Mordred who kills Arthur. And
Why can't he?
White says,
why? But why can Mordred not brook? Why can't he just be chill?
Well,
what's in him that makes him do that when everyone else is willing to look away?
We could say there's a couple different things. First, Mordred isn't a particularly good knight, so he's constantly getting schooled by Lancelot. He's not terrible, but Lancelot's just better in every way. Mm-hmm. And Lancelot is favored by the king. Constantly, the king, like everybody knows what's going on, and the king just looks the other way. This really rankles with Mordred, especially because sometimes his family is disciplined for doing things they oughtn't do, right? But especially there's another political dimension. I don't think it's ever explicitly mentioned, but we can probably read into it. The fact is that if Lancelot gives Guinevere a son, that son would have right of claim before Mordred, right? It would be passed off as Arthur and Guinevere's son, which would be his whole son, right? His legitimate son. Mordred is his illegitimate son. And everyone kind of knows that Mordred is Arthur's son, but really, like on paper, he's his nephew. So although Arthur favors him and leaves him in charge of the kingdom unwisely, for example, he's not really an heir. And if Lancelot and Guinevere were to produce a child, that would be passed off as Arthur's, which is why that kind of thing is treason, right? That's why adultery with the king's wife is a treasonous act, because it muddies the line of succession. Suddenly we don't know if it's really the king's son or not. So these are probably some of the reasons why Mordred can't be chill. But remember, I just want to be very clear about this. Arthur doesn't know that he's committing incest with Morgan because she disguises herself. And what White says about that is that it's unfair, right? But in the medieval world, sometimes innocence isn't enough. And I think that comes back to the whole idea of tragedy, right? Like you can make all the right decisions and still fail. Sometimes being innocent isn't enough to protect you. These are really important lessons. They're lessons about reality. And one of the weak points maybe of the Western tradition is we don't actually focus on these things. We really do tend to believe that if you do everything right and you mind your P's and Q's and you tick all your boxes, it's like what old Noakes says at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring. You know, if you mind your own business, no harm will come to you, right? But that's not how things actually are. Harm can come to you if you keep your head down and cross your T's and dot your I's. And I think that's what Mallory and indeed the Matter of Britain teach us. You can that tragedy exists not just for kings, but for paupers, captains and cooks, right? We all can face the same challenges. And what Mallory gives us is a way to meet those with dignity.
It brings to mind another king. Oedipus was also innocent in one sense, in a very similar sense, right? Because he doesn't know that this woman is his mother. He doesn't know his wife is his mother. Oh, can you talk to us a little bit about the stories of Arthur within their medieval Christian context? What's the relationship there between the emergence of the Arthur stories, the popularity of the Arthur stories, and the sort of dominant Christian narrative?
Certainly. I can touch on that. That's an answer to that would be a dissertation, right? Okay. That would be the subject of an entire dissertation.
We've got another 11 minutes or so.
Well, one thing I'll say is, in the High Middle Ages, as the romance kind of solidifies into a genre, there is a sort of vapidity to it, right? It's kind of empty of traditional Christian virtues. It has its own virtues. Lots of sighing, kissing, things that go on and you don't actually get to see them, but everybody knows, right?
So this is about what? Is this before or after the Arthur story?
This is before Arthuriana.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So there's a push, I think, from some segments of the writing, creating troubadour style audience to get away from romance and closer to the tradition of the chronicle. Now, we think of chronicle today, when we hear that word, we might think of like a history book, right? Which is ostensibly what a chronicle is. The most famous one's probably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. You open that up and it's a list of dates and it tells you the important things. 793, dire portents in the air, whirlwinds and fiery dragons were seen. And a little after that, the ravages of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne amid rapine and slaughter. And then Bishop Otho died. And then in 794, this is what happens. You read it, it's just a list of events, right? It's not a narrative. These are the big things that happened in this year. It's like the Wikipedia year summaries, if you've ever looked at those.
Right.
You type it in, it'll tell you all the important things that happened. It's a chronicle. Now, the medievals took this literally. They wrote the chronicles and they read them and they just simply believed everything that was in them, largely unproblematically, not entirely, but largely. And so we have these two distinct things, right? We have the romance, the story, and we have the chronicle, facts, right? Reality. And someone had the clever idea of, well, why can't we have both? Why can't we have historical fiction, we'd call it today? So that's what they do. That's why the Matter of Britain is about a figure that they believed existed, and for which there is some evidence that there was an historical Arthur. There's a recent book called The Historical Arthur and the Gawain Poet, which goes into this and attempts to identify the historical Arthur. These arguments have been made for a very long time. My belief is that there probably was like an initiating character, but that he wasn't anything like the Arthur in Le Morte Arthur, right? That's a story. But there was some sort of genesis, probably a general or dukes, actually, right? Basically a battlefield leader named Arcturus or Arthur. That becomes the kind of germ of all these stories. This is passed on by people who are initially monks. People like Geoffrey of Monmouth and William of Malmesbury, who are both Welsh. Monks like Gildas and Nennius, who are Welsh chroniclers. They have a political agenda, which is to kind of go Wales, but also they have a moral, theological agenda, which is to convey certain kind of virtues. And so they begin to create around this character a culture of, here's what a good king is like, so that these chronicles cease to be purely historical and they become instructive. This guy's a bad king. Let's look at Vortigern. He's a real person who really did exist, right? What did he do? He invites the barbarians in to fight his enemies, and then he stiffs them. That's not a good idea, because then the barbarians kill him, and they take land in lieu of pay, and they settle down next to all the people whose king they've just killed. This is probably somewhat disruptive to the community. But then look at a king like Arthur, right? Arthur establishes law and order. Arthur rules justly. He protects the church, right? He fights off the barbarians using his own men. And he rules comfortably and well. So there's a nice instructive. Now, a good king rules like this, a bad king rules like this. The bad king comes to a bad end, the good king comes to a good end. So over time, as this develops into a story, I think it kind of accretes all these different virtues or lessons about virtue into the narrative itself. That makes it an instructive tool rather than purely a matter of, entertainment, right? It edifies and delights rather than just delights.
Is Arthur's fatal flaw his passivity? Is he trying to be too is it his unwillingness to punish the wrongdoing of those closest to him that causes everyone else to suffer?
It's a very relevant question, isn't it? Because we've just had a president who's pardoned his son for deeds that he was found guilty of by a jury. Is it wrong for him to look the other way, effectively as president, pardon it, right? Let it go. I don't think there's any concrete answer to that question. But you can make the case either way, right? Over the summer, this past summer, 2024, we did on my podcast, which is a literature podcast, 14-part series on Le Morte d'Arthur. And when we came to the end and Arthur's death, that was the question that came up. Oughtn't Arthur just have, pursued the law? Shouldn't he have just, as soon as this thing with Lancelot and Guinevere was known, shouldn't he have just made a clean break, exile Lancelot, right? But this comes back to something I said earlier, right? There's all these competing webs of obligation and duty and loyalty. Lancelot is his best knight. Lancelot has saved the kingdom. Mm-hmm. If Arthur had exiled or executed Lancelot early on, then Camelot might have fallen for lack of Lancelot. So it becomes kind of impossible to find a way out of it, which I think is the point, right? There's no safe route. There's no way that Arthur could have acted that would have saved the realm. He's doomed. That's the point. He can't make different decisions that somehow resolve it all. No matter what he does, he's doomed. So the question then is, what's the way to be doomed with the maximum amount of integrity? Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to look at Arthur and say, he does that, right? Everything he does is completely understandable. And even if you don't agree with it, you can still say, yes, I see why you would have done that, and I can respect that.
And I'm saying this is part of the ongoing appeal of the story, is that in some sense, all of us have to ask, how do I be doomed with the most possible integrity?
Exactly, because we are. I mean, ultimately, the nature of mortality is that everyone is doomed, right?
Right.
Memento mori, you will die. How will you die in such a way that the conclusion of your life feels like a fitting and just conclusion to your story, and not something that's incongruous or unstable or disruptive or lacking in honor and dignity? How do you end your story in a way that feels correct, right? That gives it a happy ending insofar as that's possible. Arthur doesn't have a happy ending, but he has the happiest possible ending that he could have had, I guess.
Is he still on Avalon?
Well, Mallory says at the end of Le Morte d'Arthur, he says, some men say that he went to Avalon and he will come, whence he will come again, to put all to right. And that this is why on his tomb it reads, Rex quandam rexque futurus, right? The king once and the king to be. But Mallory says that he thinks Arthur is dead. Mm. Now, Mallory fought in the Wars of the Roses, and he's writing Le Morte d'Arthur from prison, where he's effectively a political prisoner. His faction is out of favor. He was loyal to the Duke of Warwick, and he rebels against Edward IV and gets himself killed at the Battle of Towton. So Mallory is in prison. He's been in prison most of his adult life, but now he's really in prison. He's been excluded by name from all the general pardons that are being offered, so he's just stuck there. So he probably feels a little bit hard done by, because like Arthur, in Mallory's view, probably, he's done everything he was supposed to do. He was faithful to his liege, right, the Earl of Warwick, and he did everything he was supposed to do, and now he's in prison under this Yorkist king, and it's really bad. He thinks he'll never get out. He does actually eventually get out, but he dies shortly thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've run out of time. Tell me, I guess the last question. We mentioned before we started recording that all of a sudden there seems to be so much of an upsurge in interest in everything folklorish, everything legendary. I've written quite a bit on Twitter about what the sort of general cultural crisis of meaning. Do you think the stories of Arthur are part of that? People will return to them in this sort of meaning-seeking way?
Well, they have done I think meaning-seeking way is the trick, right? There's the Guy Ritchie King Arthur a few years ago, and then there's a more recent one. And I've seen these, of course. It's my field. I have to see them. And I always come away saying, well, that's an interesting story, but you don't really get it, right? You only kind of get it, right? That the tragedy is something that's tacked on and it's not central to what's going on here. And that really is, as I've written elsewhere, Fair Forward and the European Conservative and in books and papers, I've always argued that the tragedy is central. So when these stories kind of just forget about it or they even elide it entirely, I think they're missing the point. With that said, I think it's possible for our crisis of meaning to cause people to look at a story like King Arthur and ask the questions that you're asking today. Why does this keep coming up? Why do we keep talking about Arthur? If it's just a story about knights and wizards, then, why not talk about Robert Jordan or J.R.R. Tolkien or, any other of the fantasy authors of the past 50 to 100 years, right? They'd be just as good. Why do we keep coming back to Arthur? This old story that is in its sources very difficult and unapproachable for many people. Even Mallory, who's writing in a sort of combination of Middle English and modern English. He's right on the end of the Middle English era, right? He's largely readable today. Even he is still difficult for many people. Why go back to that, right? Why not just talk about Harry Potter? It's got wizards, right? And I think once you start asking that question and you start looking at the text, then you get the answers that we've brought up today, that there's stuff in it that just isn't found in the same way in anything else. The tragedy is its central focus. And that is what makes it, I think, a very different kind of story than you'll get in Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or something of that sort. Although there, of course, is a tragic element in both of those stories. It's not the central overriding concern that it is in Mallory and in The Matter of Britain. And also, neither of those stories really teach you the lesson of failure as sometimes inescapable. What Star Trek calls the Kobayashi Maru scenario.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating talk.
It's been a delight to be here. Thank you again for inviting me.
Tell people where they can learn more about you and what you're doing.
Oh, certainly. I guess my center for work right now, which has my bio page and all my links to all my work, is at criticalreadings.com, which is a similar podcast. We talk about literature, the central works of the Western canon. And if you want to know more about Mallory or Arthuriana more generally, we have series on not only Le Morte d'Arthur, but also Tennyson's Idylls of the King, his verse version of The Matter of Britain.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.